Thank you to everybody for coming and joining us tonight. This is the fourth and final lecture in the named series, the Weiss Lecture Series for the 2019-2020 academic year. I'm sorry, the 2018-2019. I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Matthew Robb. I'm a faculty member in the School of Design Strategies at Parsons, the institutional home of the Weiss Lecture Series. The series was started in the year 2002 to commemorate the life of the artist, sculptor, and business avatar, Stephen Weiss, also the husband of the preeminent fashion designer and Parsons alumna and Board of Governors member, I believe I have that right, Donna Karan. Over the past 16 years, these lectures have allowed us to bring just a huge, diverse range of culturally and socially significant, intellectually active members of the design communities, journalism, political activism, fine arts, and a range of other fields, often dealing in some way with either the intersections of business, design, humanities type concerns, shared concerns of our modern world. The lecture series is complemented by a journal, the Journal of Design Strategies, which I edit, and I also have a background role in organizing the lecture series. That's what I'm doing up here. The Journal of Design Strategies is available for free on the online platform issue.com. It's easy to find. We're also happy to share hard copies of our beautifully designed and produced journal when we have them, which we have most back issues, through our email address jds@newschool.edu. Both the Stephen Weiss Lecture Series and the journal are supported financially, very generously, by Donna Karan and the Karen Weiss Foundation, as well as members of their family, including Gabrielle Karan, Corey Weiss, and Lisa Weiss, and we're grateful for their ongoing and sustained support over these years. We have a very distinguished guest tonight, and we're delighted to have Professor Arturo Escobar. I'm going to ask my colleague, Andrew Shea, who is one of the co-organizers of this year's series, to help to introduce him and also to describe and motivate this year's lecture series as a whole. So, Andrew?
Thank you, Matt. It's been a real pleasure working with Matt to make this happen. So I know this is one of many that have happened in the past, I guess it's been 9 or 7 years now, but we've been really fortunate to be part of this event, and thank you for that. I'm not doing this along with Mariana and Amatullo. We've had a really fun time putting this together, and as you can see, the topic is focused on globalization, not a new term, but a lightning rod term depending on who you talk to. And so we've done some thinking around what this means for this series. And as you can see, it has some kind of a tagline that connects to those. But some of the questions we're trying to interrogate focus on what the benefits and the drawbacks of this term. What does it mean to have an interconnected world? What future do we really want? And of course, as designers, at least for at least most of us designers, we're interested in being part of this process and taking an active role in framing our future. So I'm going to give you a brief overview. This is kind of like a look back of this series this year. It's been a lot of fun, as I mentioned, and we started all the way back in October with a panel discussion about gender equality. And we had the Laurie Adelman from Women Deliver, who does a lot of work internationally around this topic. Fatou Wari from UNICEF, who focuses on women and girl-specific points of view within the work that UNICEF does. And we were joined by Sujatha Jasudasan, our own from Milano, who helped moderate a panel. Then in December, we had Indy Johar from Dark Matters Laboratory visit us. He was talking a lot about governance and specifically about how we as designers and thinkers and makers can create a more open source, transparent world around that and contribute to a governance which is more ground up than bottom down. And very recently we welcomed Ezio Manzini, no stranger to the New School, founder of the Desis Network. He recently wrote a book called The Politics of the Everyday. And his work talked a lot about relationships, and his talked a lot about relationships and specifically how some of those are falling apart and how we can think about fixing those. And of course, all these folks talked a lot more than what I just described, and this is the time that I can show off the fact that we have these documented on a website as videos. We have all three documented, and you're welcome to go to this newish website that features all the work from our guests and also the videos. And with that, brings us to tonight with Arturo Escobar. And I'm going to welcome my co-curator, Mariana Amatullo, to welcome him.
So good evening, and I want to again echo Andrew to say thank you to Matt and say thank you to Andrew for the pleasure of working together this year. It's really a privilege and a joy to welcome Arturo to the New School and to Parsons. Arturo Escobar is the Keenan Distinguished Professor of Anthropology Emeritus at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and he's affiliated to two excellent doctoral programs in universities that I had the opportunity to visit and lecture at in Colombia. He is part of the doctoral program on design and creation at the Universidad de Caldas in Manizales, and on environmental sciences at the Universidad del Valle in Cali, Colombia. And Arturo is a native Caleño. His main interest, he's really one of those encyclopedic thinkers and scholars, because his main interests really span many disciplines, from political ecology to ontological design and the anthropology of development, social movements, and technoscience. And over the past 25 years, he has worked closely with Afro-Colombian social movements in the Colombian Southwest. Many of you might be very familiar with one of his very well-known books, Encountering Development, The Making and Unmaking of the Third World. And most recently, Arturo has brought to us a book that has really, I think, marked a very specific moment in time in the discourse of design and design crossing over to what we can learn from anthropology and from a perspective of the global South. And this is Designs for the Pluriverse, Radical Interdependence, Autonomy, and the Making of Worlds. And when we heard Arturo speak last year, some of us were at the University of Limerick in TRS. His presentation was really transformative, and many of us had been reading the book, and again, just a joy to have you have accepted this invitation, Arturo. I want to just point that we couldn't have a more significant speaker to end this series around such a contested concept as globalization. To quote Arturo in a fragment of his book, he says, if we start with a presupposition, striking perhaps, but not totally far-fetched, that the contemporary world can be considered a massive design failure, certainly the result of particular design decisions, is it a matter of designing our way out? Design offers a tantalizing tangibility, and critical design is critical thought translated into materiality. All good design offers an alternative to how things are. And this is a very important provocation. I think that Arturo is an inspiration in terms of encouraging us to think about the transformative side of design, the problematic side of design, and the deeply humanistic and relational side of design, and many worldviews cohabiting with one another. This is something a lot of us research and teach and study here at the New School and at Parsons. And again, we are in for a very special evening with Professor Escobar. So please welcome him, Danilo.
Um, Thanks very much, Mariana, Andrew, Ahalia, Persot, for the wonderful support for my visit here, the Weiss lectures as well, Matthew, Rob, for the invitation. It is really a pleasure to be here and to present you some ideas that I've been working on for close to a decade that crystallized in that book that Mariana mentioned, Designs for the Pluriverse. And I want to start by giving you a very brief idea about what the lecture is about. Beginning with the title. I think the title involves a theory, a politics, and a method. The politics might be the easiest way to see it, is the concept of praxis as an engaged form of action and knowledge production for social transformation. The theory is a bit more difficult, but it has to do with that word of ontology, which for now, let's say that it refers to the creation of the conditions for life, and hence for alternative realities and alternative worlds. And the politics and the method is, of course, design, and especially certain trends on design that are particularly attuned to the fact that we are devastating the earth and we are devastating each other along the way. And so to give you a sense of more specific with the lecture, let's see. Start beginning with the context, see if I can get to what this, okay. An intuitive introduction to the topic that has to do with the serious, actually, topic of globalization, which is that maybe the best or the largest framework in which we can situate the question of design today is the question of the global crisis, the planetary crisis that we're all facing, which is a multifaceted crisis of energy, climate, poverty, inequality, meaning, food, and so forth. And hence, what kinds of responses might be given to that crisis. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Then the second part, and maybe I should mention here that the talk is actually it's almost two talks in one, which is a little bit like cheating, but because we're supposed to develop just one. I mean, there are two standard models. One is you do a little bit of theory in a case study, or the other one you do a lot of theory with a little case study. I'm going to try to do half and half. Some of the theory of my own is just my own take on what is happening with design studies today. And then a case study, a very provisional case study, which is the part 3, an application of transition design and autonomous design principles to this region in Colombia, devastated by 100 years of really pernicious development strategy based on the expansion of sugarcane and cattle ranching. And in between, we'll talk a little bit about those trends in design that I find particularly interesting and exciting. Okay. And beginning again with an intuitive introduction to the crisis. This is from a Palestinian artist, Mona Hataoum, has a series of hotspots. And what she wants to convey with this is that the entire planet is a hotspot. It's a hotspot of social, economic, and political conflict. Actually, also of environmental conflict. This is obviously more literal in the sense of global warming. And we ask the question of design's role in all of this, creating this crisis, of moving us beyond the crisis. And is design world-sustaining or world-destroying, or is it both? And how can we tip the balance maybe towards the world-sustaining dimension of design? And there is a lot of debate today in many parts of the world about crisis. There's a growing conversation in France about collapsology, the collapse. If you do a Google search on collapsology, you'll find that all of the different takes about that supposedly impending collapse of Western civilization. Extinction Rebellion, have you heard about Extinction Rebellion, anybody? Okay, a few. It's just this whole week is Extinction Rebellion's first presentation into the global society of climate change activism. They've been calling for massive civil disobedience, active civil disobedience against climate change, corporations and governments and so forth. And Extinction Rebellion for Life. It's a rebellion for life, for the defense of life and different ways of living. In the Latin American take, which is what I know best, there are many manifestations of this. We begin with the first one. It's a journal, it's an activist journal from about 10 years ago, when they talk about alternativas civilizatorias, civilizational alternatives. And indigenous peoples, at least in 1992, have been saying that the contemporary crisis is a crisis of a civilizational model, the Western capitalist model, just a shorthand. The second one is on indigenous, it's a summit of indigenous spirituality. But the subtitle says, or capitalism dies or the earth dies. So even an indigenous spirituality approach to that is calling for a very significant transformation. The third one is the most well known by you, Otro Mundo es Posible from the World Social Forum, Another World is Possible, the Zapatista definition of the pluriverse, Un mundo donde quepan muchos mundos, a world where many worlds fit, that has become more or less a standard definition of pluriverse. And the last one for me, this is also from an indigenous meeting in Colombia, which is a beautiful depiction of relationality, of a relational cosmovision, a relational way of seeing life based on the acceptance of the radical interdependence of everything that exists. That everything exists because everything else exists. And we sort of not know that from ecology, but this is a much more profound take on that. Okay. For me, this was a great sentence by a Chilean, a Mapuche, Machi, shaman, Adriana Paredes Pinda, who said that tenemos que reaprender a caminar el mundo como seres vivos. We have to learn again how to be alive, because we forgot how to be alive, how to be good human beings, because we live against each other and against the non-human world. So what we talk in this field that I'm part of, it's a growing sort of field called political ontology, and I'll tell you a little bit of a sense for what it is later on. We talk about how all of these indigenous worlds, Afro-descendants, peasant communities, even people in cities that are rising up against extractive operations by globalization, against destruction of space in cities, of place, against destruction of economies from the space of the local economies, against destruction of mineral resources, and et cetera, is that these worlds are mobilizing for the defense not only of resources, not only of lakes and lands and mountains, but for the defense of an entirely different way of worlding or of seeing life. There are many ways to depict interdependence. This is from people write around Lynn Margulis's concept of symbiogenesis, a beautiful world, beautiful art. Obviously, weavings, indigenous weavings. The next one that is from a young Dakota graphic designer, Sadie Red Wing, who uses the Dakota alphabet to do beautiful artwork and tapestry such as this one, and political work. And so what does this have to do with design? So we move into the second part of the lecture. Design is a practice of worlding. The design is about constructing and creating the conditions for life and for constructing different kinds of worlds. I was at RISD last week from an exhibit at the museum that uses the concept of repair and mending. That mending can serve as a visual and emotional aid to socially engage design thinking. So in my talk, I use healing. There's a lot of these concepts that have been used: healing, repairing, regenerating, renovating, and so forth, that I think are very interesting. And so if we look at what is going on today under the conventional lens of design, we find, this is from Bruce Mao, very well known to all of you, I'm sure, the Toronto design thinker office, that is a very interesting, I find this very interesting, but at the same time very problematic conventional rendering of design. Now we can do everything with design. We know design is about everything. Design is about the design of the world. We can even create new materials. We can create designing. We can designing materials with nanotechnology. So what does that mean? This is not about healing. This is not about mending. Is it or not? Or this kind of imaginary, the conventional imaginary of technology and the artificial, that again it takes for granted the devastation, the ongoing devastation of the world, and it is entailed to keep on constructing worlds that work well for the elite, but not really for anybody else, or at least in principle. So can this become also the socio-technical source of healing? This from the OMA office is an otherwise interesting report about decarbonizing Europe. But if you look at the technological imaginary of, I guess, the Afro-European of 2050, with all these wearables and technological devices, as if that were going to take us out of this crisis. That is a much more profound crisis because it's about capitalism, which is a design world, because it's about modernity, which is a designing force, and because of the impacts, ontological impacts of many worlds being destroyed and rendered unsustainable. Now, what are the interesting trends? And this is going to be very quick and dirty, but most of you probably know this already in terms of design thinking today. Ezio Anzini, who was here a few months ago, I guess, talks about now when everybody designs, when everybody's a designer, what happens with design? And how can design become part of this civilizational transition, as he also calls it? There is a lot of new ideas and new concepts that you know much better than me. I'm going to focus a bit on design for social innovation, transition design, and autonomous design. But this is for me the driving question. Design as a domain of thought and action concerning the production of life and the making of worlds. So is design that? That's not the usual way of talking about design. And what has taken us to get there in some ways is to develop an ontological approach to design. This, for me, is still the most succinct statement about why design is ontological from an 86 book, that in designing tools, we're designing ways of life. Think about the digital devices, how we design those, but they are designing us at the same time. So that we are confronted with this double movement in design, that design designs, we design our world, and the world designs us back. The same for cities. We design the cities, but we don't really know what kinds of people, what kinds of humans, what kinds of subjects we become because of the kinds of habitability and urban habitability in which we have been engaged. So these are the questions that people working in ontological design are discussing. I've been sort of trying to map this a little bit as an outsider, increasingly also as an insider, mapping these trends, both in the global north and the global south. The most interesting one for me, which are here, and the emergence at the intersection of what could be called a transnational critical design studies field. There are many of these. All of these it's a very uneven field. Some of them are more developed than others. They intermix also. There are conversations now between the global north and the global south. People in the north are talking about decolonial design or decolonizing design and so forth. And people in the south are talking about ontological design. So it's a very interesting moment for me, a fascinating moment in which we can. Does this mean that there's a new paradigm, as some people call it, emerging? And I think it's a question for all of us to ask and to try to answer. I don't have a complete good sense of to what extent these trends are permeating or pervading the mainstream design fields. Some people say, yeah, that's happening. Some other people say, no, it's just a question of a few academics, design academics here and there. But the fact that they are having a very important impact. I really like this statement as a description of what is going on today from the book by Professors Mariana Amatullo and Andrew Shea. Shea, you say Shea? Shea, like Che Guevara? No, Shea. Sorry about that. Okay, in which what the idea is that designers are becoming more and more aware of this increasingly important role of design. But we are not yet quite able or equally able to articulate the context and the challenges of that new role that design is playing. So the design for social innovation has to begin even with this question about what is it, what is the world in which we are innovating within. This is transition design, or design for transitions. Carnegie Mellon University has a PhD program, which is very interesting. It's been around for a few years, for about 4 or 5 years. What I like about this is that they redefine the design field into these different domains, where the conventional designs, product services, and so forth. Then social innovation begins to push at the edges of the paradigm, so to speak. And transition design, in theory at least, takes a step forward and tries to get out of the design, of the paradigm. What is the paradigm? Is it Western capitalism, Western modernity? Is it, well, we'll try to name it in a moment, but that's another important trend, I think, to pay attention to. This is a much smaller one. This is a group in Boston, Design Studio for Social Innovation. Very interesting, for social intervention, very interesting work. They are just putting out the first book out of their decade-long experience, in which they use their interventions. They have a number of interventions. This is one of the most interesting one, the creation of social emergency response centers where people can go, poor people in Boston and other parts of the US actually now, can go to have, to talk about violence against women, poverty, inequality, unemployment, etc. But their whole idea is how we can use these interventions as an entry point into what they call rearranging the social. That it is not enough to just denounce the big isms, the racism, capitalism, heteropatriarchalisms, and so forth, but that we have to sort of bring it down, those arrangements at the level of everyday arrangements as a way to rearrange the social. Super interesting. I think this is going to be a very useful book for teaching and training. Decolonizing design, let me just put all of them. Oops, sorry. Is from, more strictly from the Global South, if you wish, but there are more people using it here. And it has, this is one of the main features of this. And there is a web page on decolonial design already, started by a Pakistani, Ahmed Ansari, actually. So this is not only Latin America, although the main basis is in Latin America, in which what some of the features are to be able to figure out to what extent design has been such a central, so dependent on the Western historical experience, the creation of this Western modern heteropatriarchal capitalist system in which we all live today, increasingly worldwide. Second, that once you have this historical awareness, pluralizing the history of design, that design is not just something of the West. There have been design traditions in many other parts of the world, so bringing those into the conversation. Creating spaces for other ways of designing, emerging from non-dominant ways of worlding in everywhere in the world. There are non-dominant ways of worlding, including in Europe and in the US. So how do we bring those into the conversation as well? And finally, how can we engage in collaborative, symmetrical collaborative projects with people in different parts of the Global South that are working on somewhat similar issues? So decoloniality, decolonial design is an important concept in these new conversations. And my own proposal has been for autonomous design. And autonomous design, the basic idea is where we can reorient design ontologically to be able to contribute to the social and political struggles of communities that are opposing globalization. So that's why I say this is a field that emerges at the intersection of very interesting new theories about ontological politics in anthropology, in geography, in political philosophy, on the one hand, and on the other hand, on social struggles against extractivism, social struggles for the defense of different kinds of worlds. And some of the features of autonomous design, I always start with this presupposition that every community practices the design of itself. In a way, it applies to every person. Every person practices the design of oneself, or herself, himself. And what is the goal of autonomous design? Is to be able to strengthen that communal basis of social life. If globalization has been the breakdown, the systematic breakdown of everything communal and everything collective, the systematic creation of individuals that exist in markets, in competitive markets, etc., in competitive societies, etc., then an imperative today is to bring back that communal dimension of life, and this goes again for the Global North and the Global South. Very important in doing autonomous design work is to be able to understand what is the political project of these groups in struggle, what is the political project of these communities. And in many cases, not always, and with contradictions. I mean, this is not, there isn't a simple group. Even the Zapatista has lots of contradictions that for many people are sort of, in a way, the perfect struggle. That foster non-patriarchal, non-racist, non-liberal, very important, based on this idea of the possessive individual and private property only There are many other possibilities for being and for existing than those of the capitalist economy. Post-capitalist forms what we could call convivial societies. Okay. Autonomia can be defined as a theory of practice of interexistence. So autonomia is not about isolation, it's not autarky, it's about strengthening your community for sharing from the perspective of autonomy. Two examples very quickly from the work that I've been doing for the past 20 years almost, from the Colombian Southwest, and before I move into the second part of the talk. This has been going on over the past few weeks, few months. The indigenous people of NASA, indigenous people of Colombia, from the Colombian Southwest, blocking roads and mobilizing massively, thousands and thousands and thousands, to push the government to agree to actually fulfill their agreements that they have been signing for the past 30, 40 years that the government hasn't fulfilled, but basically for what they call the liberation of Mother Earth. This is a really amazing group that says that the Earth has been enslaved, and as long as the Earth is enslaved, so are we, all humans, and non-humans obviously are enslaved. So this is a task for everybody, not just for indigenous peoples or for peasants. It's a task in which everybody has to be engaged. The liberation of Mother Earth. We'll get back to this at the end. From an Afro-Colombian wonderful struggle as well, a group of women from a small community in the same region, opposed to illegal gold mining in the territories, and did a massive mobilization between their region to Bogota, a march on foot of 3 weeks long, and that along the way wrote these very interesting, fascinating texts in which they say that because of our life is stronger, our love for life is stronger than our fear of death, and territories and life are not sold, they are loved and defended. So this is a different ontology. It's a relational ontology, an ontology in which the river of the community, the territory, the ancestors, and the entire spectrum of humans and non-humans are what the life is about and what needs to be defended. Okay, so let me start with the second part. Which is a very early and provisional application of transition design and autonomous design. It concerns, as I mentioned at the beginning, this region in southwest Colombia, the red spot over there, covering 2 provinces, departamentos, Valle del Cauca and Cauca. A beautiful valley, I'll show you pictures in a moment, extending from northern Cauca to Risaralda, which is another department up there. And the valley itself has been completely taken over by sugarcane. So you see the geographical valley in yellow, and you see what's been taken over by the sugarcane. You see that they correspond to almost 1-to-1. There is very little left that is not sugarcane, and these are the main sugarcane factories, sugar mills. It's a region, just another more topographical map, that has been incorporated into the global economy since the get-go, since the 16th century, with that famous transatlantic slave trade that was the trading commodities like sugar. This was the sugar growing, sugar, cotton, and tobacco for the most part, taken to the metropolis. From the metropolis, some cheap manufacturers to Africa, enslaving people, taking the enslaved people back to the Caribbean and places, countries like Colombia for sugarcane plantation. It really begins to, from the very start, as I was saying, this is a valley that was inhabited by indigenous peoples whose lands were taken over progressively since the 16th century through different kinds of schemes, like the famous encomiendas and repartimientos, even Spaniards being given thousands of hectares for going on expeditions to kill Indians and to subdue the Indians, etc. For most of the 16th, 17th, 18th century, it was a large latifundia based on cattle and gold mining. By the end of the 18th century, there is the hacienda around sugar production with rudimentary technology that begins to consolidate. And from the first half of the 20th century on is the real takeoff of the sugarcane industry and cultivation industry, from the Trapiche hacienda to the Ingenio, so the agro-industrial sugar mill, at large scale, very large scale, at the outset of the 20th century. This sentence is for me, is a very interesting instance of the class consciousness of this group of people. It was actually a North American that ended up in Colombia in the late 18th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, and it started what today still is the largest sugar mill in the region and in the country, and in Latin America at least, saying that on January 1st, 1901, we started the first steam sugar mill operation in the country, and the rest is history, so to speak. So a little bit about the region, it's longer than that. This is just a part. It's about 350 kilometers long, between 50 and 80 kilometers wide. Sugarcane covers most of it. Until the beginning of the 20th century, still peasants, especially black peasants, indigenous peoples, and peasants had access to land as much as they needed. It was an amphibian ecology, if you wish, because there was periodic flooding from the rivers. But with the first half of the 20th century begins massive state support, investment in infrastructure to transform this region. It begins the design process of agro-industrial sugarcane production, the consolidation of the agrarian elite, and especially the replication of the TVA model, the Tennessee Valley Authority model, which is an amazing design apparatus, if you wish, discos and apparatus, that was exported in so many different parts of the world, the famous TVA model, which is this one, hailed for the most part as a great success and then exported to different parts of the world. If you look at the distance, you see this beautiful, beautiful landscape. Temperature in the valley itself is about 25 degrees year-round, about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. A couple of months, it's a little bit hotter, or a little bit cooler. But if you get closer, this is what you see. Just sugar cane, no end in sight, and incredible growth of sugarcane production to about 260,000 hectares today, and keeps on expanding, despite the fact that for many reasons it shouldn't, but anyways, that would be a different story. And erasing the history of its own designing, if you wish, along the way. So most people, most Colombians drive through this and they see this beautiful valley, so green, they say amazing, and they love it, and they celebrate this landscape of sugar cane, in song and TV soap operas and even in salsa music, celebrated. And now we're beginning to see the underside of that. 1950s, one of the areas, again, periodic floodings. After the construction of the dam in the mid-80s, the desiccation of the wetlands, all sugar cane, just a popular depiction from people, a pluriverse in a way, an agroecological set of farming, small farms, to the plantation in this century already. And of course, it's a whole entramado, it's a whole assemblage, it's a whole world that is being created here. The trucks that carry the cane that you see all over the valley all the time, because it's a year-round cultivation, and the mills, so that we have an assemblage that creates this world, that designs this world, by occupying the territories ontologically, occupying the territory physically, expelling people, and expelling other kinds of non-human life, and so forth. Maybe we can talk about the design injustice here, in some sense. I'm going to skip this. This is from the city of Cali, which is the capital city, for the sake of time. Let me see, what time did I start? Yeah, I have about 15 minutes, so I should skip this. a city of about 2.5 million people, 50% Afro-Colombian, with all the problems from the big city from the global south, and which is part, we sort of the heart of this valley. Capital of salsa music, that's part of the advertisement of the city. And then the tremendous environmental conflicts created by this model, development model. The dam itself would displace hundreds of people, thousands of people and communities, mostly black communities. Cattle rising that has deforested hundreds of thousands of hectares. Fumigation with glyphosate, produced by Monsanto, forbidden in the US, used all the time in Colombia to spray sugarcane and spray coca cultivations. The burning of the cane that produces huge environmental and public health problems because it burns and the cenizas, the ashes blow all over the valley. Of course, the near slave conditions for the black sugarcane black cutters. And a lot of resistance. This is Francia Marquez, is one of the leaders. She actually won the Goldman Environmental Award in 2018 for Latin America for her work in defense of her river and her community against gold mining and the expansion and the impact of the dam. They wanted to divert her river, her community's river, to feed into the dam. And so an amazing resistance that is going on there. People are massacred right and left, but at the same time the resistance continues. And a little bit, again, this very provisional sort of summary of what we have been doing in terms of transition design here. And it started about a year ago. We put together a group of people. I'll tell you a little bit about the group. At some point, somebody started to talk about the transition as a transition aid. Sort of like lemonade, but a transition aid. So from the situation aid to the transition aid, and it was baptized as such, la transicionada. So it's la transicionada. What does this have to do with transicionada? Well, I'll show you in a minute. I'll explain. Most of you probably know what this is. This is mate. Mate is shared. It's from Argentina and Uruguay, something that is usually shared. Obama and former President Mujica, they are not sharing the mate. Each one has their own. And so are the famous football players. I assume that Pope Francis and former President Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner are sharing one. I mean, they are Argentinians. She doesn't seem to, so they seem to be sharing one at least. And mate is supposed to be shared. So the transition aid was described by one of the participants as pasando el mate. So this is a pasando el mate kind of design approach to thinking about the transition among all kinds of different groups. So what are the goals? Is to foster a transition movement from this model to a very different model that we can begin to envision already, on agroecological grounds even, on really pluriversal intercultural grounds, with communities, so that the communities can articulate their own sense of the region and their own sense of the life projects, the concept that is used in the life projects of the communities. And again, with the larger goal being the strengthening of the communal basis of social life. So we start with the situation and move to the transition. And and you find this in many sort of the newer design literature, the creation of a co-design group is one of the most important steps that we can do at the beginning of, and I'll tell you a little bit why in a moment. And creating a design space, which is something that we're interested in doing. We haven't done it. We're just getting together in the local public university for the most part so far. These are some of the things that people said. The second one was by this architect, pretty wonderful architect, that said, the transition is an incitation to a dream, to a subversive dream. He's an eco-socialist, so it consists in terms of social and ecological justice. And this very clear awareness that we are designed all by this system, this sort of sugarcane world, this is designing us and the region, and that it does colonizing our future. That's really killing the possibility of having futures otherwise. At the beginning, we thought it was for the first meeting, that was last September, we thought that we would talk a little bit about the situation, we would move towards the desired region, and maybe talk a little bit about next steps. But those of you who have worked in Latin America know that things don't work as planned very rarely, especially when activists are involved. You arrive there, it's about 30 people, 15 activists, 15 academics. And the first thing we had to do is to introduce ourselves and have a ritual that was done by two of the Afro-Colombian feminists. It was a beautiful ritual. And then people started to gather around that and celebrating the territory and trying to recognize ourselves to overcome mistrust. And then we did a little bit of the collective mapping of social actors, a little bit of the other possible valleys, and then this is where we're at. We have 3 meetings so far only, and it will probably continue just next summer at some point. These are the group itself, 5 more or less design people, including 2 or 3 design faculty in design schools, and the academics and the activists, mostly environmentalists, feminists, and black activists and indigenous activists. This, how was it characterized? It's characterized as something that is multiple, it's locality specific. Even in a region, each locality has to, in a way, embrace its own transition. Obviously, it has to do with many temporalities. The temporality of the non-human is very different from the temporalities of the human. It has to be steered in some fashion, but let it grow from the dynamics of community and territory. It's about healing, it's about politics. And the lexicon that began to emerge, I'll just mention a couple of these for you. Obviously, another calc is possible, very clear. De lo violento a lo violento is a play of words, impossible to translate, from violence to bio-slowness, to encenegarse. Ciénaga is a wetland, to become again amphibian, a bit amphibian, to relearn to live with the territory as it was before it was dried and desiccated. And re-existence, which is a social movement category that basically means it's not just about resisting, it's about recreating the conditions for existence. Some of the main tensions, the tension between the activists and the academics, is a huge tension now. Can be very productive, can be completely destructive, in the sense that there's no reconciliation possible. We can talk about that in the question and answer period if you wish. How to welcome social and epistemic diversity in the co-design team, but at the same time having them share at least a basic relational perspective, a basic perspective of what is going on and what needs to happen. How to overcome mistrusts. Even the question of funding. The activists say, we don't want external funding. We just want to do this in an autonomous way, even on the shoestring budget. But we don't want funding from corporations, NGOs, foundations. Interesting, it sort of took me aback because I wanted to write a grant proposal. I'm holding off on that to see what happens. And the questions of short-term versus medium and long-term and so forth. Some of the challenges is this perverse network of power, as it was described, between the state, corporations, the law, and the police, the army, the armed actors, legal and illegal, the army, the paramilitaries, guerrillas, narco-traffickers, that are intent on land and water grabbing, that are just destroying everything as they move along in the so-called post-conflict. The post-conflict has extremely relative, to put it in positive terms. The question of the middle classes was pointed out as sort of the new domain of this very individualistic, consumeristic, capitalistic behavior is in the Latin American middle classes that finds themselves the happiest when they are at a shopping mall. And the urbanization, potential agglutinating issues, water. Water is fundamental to almost everything we do worldwide, but it's in this region because the water has been swallowed up and contaminated so much by the sugar cane that is really, really becoming a problem. Then water is an important one, and how to undertake legal actions on the international level about this. Okay, so that was a very sort of quick and dirty idea And I think I could go to the conclusion without having to rush so much. Okay. I wanted to start with this sentence because I found it in a very inspiring, very powerful book by a native Canadian author, Liam Simpson. Has anybody read anything by Liam Simpson? Okay. Check out this book. This is the last book. It's called The Way We Have Always Done. And in that book, I wasn't planning on talking about the book, but since I have a little bit of time, I think I can just mention it briefly. She develops what she calls a resurgence project for indigenous worlds, native indigenous worlds in Canada, that are based on the notion of grounded normativity. Grounded normativity, as I see it, is another way to name ontology. So how about from an indigenous ontology, we can develop a resurgence project and articulate it as an intellectual and political practice. Okay? We are the demand. I mean, if we take seriously indigenous ways of being, or other ways of being, doesn't have to be, then that changes the game. Going back to the point that with which we started, we're all designers and we're all design, but it also means that we have to take responsibility for those worlds we create. It's a differential ethics in the sense that, as people say in relation to climate justice, that there is, and let me see if I remember this, we are equal but differential responsibility. No, what is it? Anybody remembers? What is the concept in the climate change? Common but differentiated responsibility. So we are all in this together, but our responsibilities are different. I mean, we in the global north, of course, are much more responsible. We have polluted more, destroyed more, devastated more than poor people in the global south. Almost any time, anywhere. And the question is how, going back to the globalization, how do we interrupt that global project of fitting all worlds into one, which is the straitjacket of globalization, as seen from the perspective of the World Bank and the IMF and the WTO and the corporate elite and the Davos men and the Davos elite, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so can we think about transition design as a praxis for healing the way of life? A stitch at a time, a sketch at a time, a loop at a time. And the loop comes from something I found on the web one day. It's a song called Loops of Healing, or Healing Loops. An interesting concept there from an artist. And this is sort of the definition of design that, not a definition, it's just a way of talking about design that I came up with towards the end of the book, Designs for the Pluriverse, that if life is a web of interdependencies and interconnections, can we not see design as an invitation for us to become mindful and effective? We have to do it effectively too, because we're sort of against the clock, so to speak. Weavers and repairers or menders of the web of life, or the mesh of life. So that whatever we are, we contribute to stitch, to mend, to loop and regenerate and reutilize and refashion and these arts that are sort of in vogue right now, but do it with a sense that this is what we're doing. Some lessons from the Cauca Valley in transition. We have a thoroughly designed region. So if a region like this was the product of design, can really not be undesigned. Tony Fry talks about elimination design, that a good part of the moving after design has to be to undesigning the designs that have designed these worlds in the way in which they are. So it is a socio-technical, it has to be socio-technical transition, opens up the whole question of technology, of course, multi-scalar, a just transition. This is Damian White, who has a recent paper on just transitions. The question of scale and time. The question of scale is very important. Can a region, can we look at the transition design at the meso level, at articulation between the very micro and the meso levels? Not the larger levels, because that doesn't really exist. Okay, but at the meso level, that it has to be site specific. Okay. And the importance of the initial group. The group could have been just academics. It would have gone very smoothly. But the results, I'm sure, would have been much poorer, not as grounded as having a group that is a mix of activists and academics. Academics, we know how to operate on a very rational Cartesian way. Activists resist that for good reasons, because you never get to the real bottom of things. The potential for doing lexicons, the fact that environmental conflicts as ontological conflicts, there are conflicts over what counts as real, what kinds of worlds do we want to live and design. Is it really a dream core rising? And this one would take longer time to explain, betting on emergence, but we can talk about that if you wish in the question and answer period. And this is almost the last one. So repairing, there's a lot of emphasis on repairing and caring and healing, ontologies of care. And the fact that many of them in Latin America today are seen, there's a very interesting new wave of Latin American feminists, decolonial feminists also, Black and indigenous feminists, queer feminists, that are emphasizing a new way, a feminist and fully historicized, anti-essentialist way of looking at the feminine worlds and looking at the communal. So that these two authors in particular, Rita Segato and Raquel Gutierrez Aguilar, who in my mind are some of the most interesting Latin American thinkers at present, not only feminist thinkers, but thinkers in general, are saying that we have to opt for the relational path against the ontology of separation, emphasize that period of being community. And if we do that in a way that is dysfunctional to capital, because they also emphasize that, we have to come up to the conclusion that the strategy from now on is feminine. So what do they mean by that? What do they mean by that? I think there's a very interesting conceptualization there, and we can talk a little bit more during the conversation. I'm almost done. If you ask me about a few main principles for thinking about strategies for redesign or reweaving or what have you, I would emphasize these ones, that our strategies should contribute to recommunalizing social life, against the breakdown of everything collective and communal, and against the compulsory individualism that we face. Relocalize activities. Local food is the most important, most visible example. Local autonomies and direct democracy. Latin American feminists emphasize a lot the simultaneous depatriarchalization and decolonization of society. There is no decolonization without depatriarchalization. From the indigenous peoples, the liberation of Mother Earth. From political ontology, if you wish, the flourishing of the pluriverse. So this is just my own, it works for me. You might each reformulate that in ways that works for you. I like this formulation from Thomas Berry, a North American theologian and ecologist, passed away about 10 years ago, who coined the concept the Ecozoic era, a transition from the Ecozoic era defined as that moment when finally humans and non-humans can coexist in mutually enhancing manners, because the earth is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. The idea that transitions are always already happening, as a transition activist praxis is always going on. The Transition Town Initiative, some of you might have heard about that, is certainly a proof, an indication of this. In Colombia in particular, for the past 20 years, a number of groups have been talking about disoñar. Disoñación is a play of words that is difficult to translate as well. It's to design, to dream design, to design with dreams, and design with the dreams of the earth as well, and favor convenient tools and institutions. We'll give the last word to the indigenous Nasa people, and I want to read this with you. It says, this is why to fight for the earth is not only a duty of indigenous peoples, it is an ancestral mandate for all of the peoples, for all women and men who want to defend life. So for everybody, not just for indigenous peoples, there it is, the door is open. Thank you.
I think we do have some time for questions if anybody has some.
Comments or questions, or agreements or disagreements? I'm not going to have to ask my own question, no?
I'm curious in relation to transitional design, how you're thinking about using techniques and technologies.
About using?
Technologies, but I don't necessarily mean just, machines that go beep kind of technologies, but indigenous techniques or because it can't just be about returning to something that pre-existed, right?
Yes.
Like the transition, at least the first transition, right? If this is a re-transition, like a civilizational transition has happened. So the next one has to unfold from that. And I'm just wondering about sort of the atmosphere of planetary computing on one hand, and then sort of local technologies or techniques or practices on the other?
Why don't we collect a few? Would that be okay? And then, if there is others now.
I'm interested to know how will you differentiate holistic design from transitional design?
Holistic design?
Mm-hmm.
Hi. So you were talking about like the transition to the Ecozoic, and I was like, we're like working on this, and we are like asking ourselves in many ways, like how can we achieve that? And since like I know that it's maybe a question that you've asked yourself like many times, but maybe to have your perspective would be interesting.
The how.
Yeah, how?
Just that. One more. Okay, one more.
So I'm also wondering if you have any evidence or experiences from Colombia and Valle del Cauca of redesigning structures of land property for like community production or any purpose of the sort in your recent experience.
Mm-hmm. Okay, why don't we start with those? There's plenty there already. Maybe let me start with the last one, and then maybe move towards the first one. The question of property. Some of you might have seen Saskia Sassen's, one of Saskia Sassen's recent book called Expulsions. Is a very interesting new way of looking at globalization. And she says that what characterizes today's system of power or globalization is a new system of rule that we cannot understand well yet because of its complexity, that articulates in new ways finance, technology, governments, corporations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very complex system that produces a simple, brutal result, and that is expulsions. Expulsions of people from the land, of life from the biosphere, of local economies from the space of the economy, of people from their societies, massive incarceration like in the US, especially of young black peoples and black men and Latino men, and so forth. And land grabbing is central to that, expulsion. So, and land grabbing is going on worldwide. It's not only just a question of global north and global south, it's going on worldwide, including the cities. So confronted to that, I mean, Colombia has one of the most unequal distributions of land in the world. It's about 1% of the landowners control something like 70% of the land, of the arable land. And it's always been that way, but it became worse with the 80s and 90s narco-trafficking bonanza, where the narcos appropriated more and more land in some regions in Colombia, as you may know. So confronted to that, the question of land is crucial. I mean, it's always crucial. And that's why this indigenous group always emphasize the question of liberation of Mother Earth has two components. One is the actual recuperation of land, of ancestral lands. So they go into hacienda that is planted by sugarcane. At night, they uproot the sugarcane, they plant corn and whatever. And they might last for a few weeks, and then the army comes and takes them out again. But they have been able to recover land in that way. Something that happened with black communities in Colombia is that in the late 80s, early 90s, when the new constitution was being written, Constitution of 1991, they insisted on collective rights to the territories. And especially in the Pacific region, which is a rainforest region, the land was titled collectively to the community. So no individual title. Very interesting. It creates a very different infrastructure, design infrastructure, if you wish, for life projects. So in that region, about 5 million hectares have been titled to the black communities. Many of them had to flee the region again because of violence, but that's happening. So land reform, at least that I know in Latin America, has always been, not always, but the experience of land reform has been mostly negative. Maybe with the exception of the Mexican land reform of the 1917 revolution that did achieve a massive redistribution. So land reform is another state practice to avoid real land redistribution. So I don't know much more than that, other than that if we want to re-inhabit the planet and we want to heal the web of life, the current agro-industrial system that is based on land grabbing and on these huge monocultures has to change somehow. And that has to be put in the agenda. It's not, for the most part, with the exception of Via Campesina. Via Campesina is this large network of peasant organizations that encompasses about 200 million peasants that are in this process of recuperating land, but also on theorizing the agroecological family farming, individual and collective, as the real solution to climate change. As they say, it's the only way to cool down the planet. And I think they might be right. Okay, that about land. The Ecozoic, no, that's more difficult, just a second. Holistic design, I'm not sure of what is meant by the term. I assume that it's a design that incorporates, that is not just about producing a single commodity or a single product, but incorporates many aspects of what goes on into the design process, and also sees design as a more complex social practice. Is that right? I think in that sense, it goes very well with transition design. Moreover, one of the main inputs of the transition design framework, at least as is the one that has been developed by Carnegie Mellon, is a holistic science. Has to be, especially systems, what they call living systems theory. Living systems theory, which is the backbone of the transition design people, how to incorporate that idea of planning, sort of planning and designing with systems, planning and designing with nature and with life in general. I think that's a very important component as well. The question of technology, the last two questions are interconnected. The question of technology and the Ecozoic, the transition to the Ecozoic. And I think, as usual, there are two dimensions of that. The first dimension for me is how these concepts, these processes are being discussed in the academy, in theory, in social theory, design theory, how the transition is being discussed in design theory, and how it's actually happening in social practice, especially with social movements. And we have to look at both at the same time and sort of establish conversations between what is going on in the social movements and resistance movements with what is going on in critical social theory. Transition design, you can say, is one answer. Who was the person who asked the transition to the ecozone? Is one answer to your question. And they are aware of the concept of ecozoic. They don't use it. They, even somebody like Ezio Mancini, who talks about the transition to a sustainable world, to sustainable living. So sustainability is a code phrase, for better or for worse, because it's not a perfect concept. For the most part, it's not actually a very good concept. For giving us an orientation for transition activities. The political side of that, which is the more interesting side, which is how are all of these transition practices that are happening on the ground, the transition town initiatives, the social movements for the liberation of Mother Earth, people in neighborhoods who are trying to fight against gentrification and doing urban gardens all over the place whenever they can, like in Detroit or in Barcelona or what have you. How all of this is the question of how these movements are going to connect with each other. Can they really connect? Which is the question of scaling up, but now the question of scale is not good enough either. So a lot of people are thinking in social theory and in the practice about horizontal ways of connecting up with movements. So we have the metaphors of networks and rhizomes and assemblages and self-organizing meshworks and tapestry. Some friends in South Asia and Latin America are working on something they call a tapestry of alternatives. A tapestry or tapestry? Tapestry of alternatives, sort of a weave of alternatives, using the language of self-organizing and emergence, how as activists we can foster national and regional encounters of these initiatives in such a way that they can be to really connect with each other and generate this more self-organizing dynamic. So that's, in a way, that's a huge question. It's one of the main questions today is how to effectively mount not only resistance to this globalization, but a counter designs to the global designs, if you wish. And it obviously has to do with technology. I mean, technology is central to that. And sort of the imaginaries of technology that I showed you are sort of the dominant imaginaries of technology. The epitome of that is sort of the great singularity hypothesis, that somehow there's going to be a sudden shift, radical shift. The guru that talks about that, what's his name? Raymond Kurzweil, has this book called The Great Singularity, and now the Great Singularity is coming. And that around 2050 is that he sets it now, something like that, that because of the intensification of technology in all these different domains, from nanotechnology, digital technology, synthetic biology, all of a sudden humanity is going to transcend, to move to another stage of evolution towards what he calls a life beyond biology. It's extremely problematic, to say the least. I mean, I found it very patriarchal and capitalistic, needless to say, vision, but that one that is very seductive. So can we think about technology otherwise? So we go back to the academic tradition, the social theory archives, and we find that, yes, of course, there have been many other ways of thinking about technology. One of the ones that I find most interesting is Ivan Illich, who in the 60s, 70s, and 80s was writing these amazing books about the disabling character of modern technologies, from transportation to work to education to health. and advocating for what he called convivial tools or convivial societies. I use a little bit of that. I have a little recap of that in the Introduction to Designs for the Pluriverse, especially his 1973 book called Tools for Conviviality. So the question is, how do we design technologies that can promote and support the buen vivir, the good living, the holistic conceptions of social life and design, as opposed to having it the other way around, that everything becomes subordinated to technology and economy. Technology and economy would have to become subordinated to the everything else that is the most important parts of life. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what comes to mind. Any other comments or questions if we have time? I don't know if we have time, but maybe a couple more.
Arturo, thank you so much.
Yes.
You mentioned that sustainability is not a perfect concept, and I wonder if you could speak to, can you speak, given what you said about the pluriversal phenomenon that we're witnessing all over the world, can you foresee a time when design will not be a perfect concept?
Interesting that today at lunch, and also when I was at RISD last week, a lot of people started by saying, well, I'm a designer, but I increasingly don't find myself liking what I do, or something along those lines. I started to think about reluctant designers. What reluctant designers? Tony Fry is beginning to talk about design after design. So how does the redesign of designing will go on in a way that will have to transform design significantly, or just realize that design will continue to just be a technology for, making worlds for the powerful. And what I thought about that, there was somebody who introduced herself at RISD as an industrial, so everybody was saying, I'm an industrial designer. So you can say, and when I'm asked why I'm interested in design now, and even at lunch I had this conversation with Eduardo and Clive, and I say, well, was it with them or was it with the students? Or maybe with the students, can't remember. And I say something like, well, design is like a placeholder. It allows me to think some things that I cannot think even in my own field of anthropology anymore, or geography, or much less, obviously, in economics, political science. So I think whatever kind of professional we are today, we have to be a reluctant professional, a reluctant designer, a reluctant anthropologist, a reluctant engineer, meaning by that willing to question that discipline's embeddedness in these world-destroying systems, and how we can move from that to world-sustaining. And the concept of world-sustaining is one that, for instance, this Pakistani designer that just finished his PhD dissertation at Carnegie Mellon, I was part of his committee, he's talking about world-sustaining design, Ahmed Ansari, and with what he calls a cosmological perspectivism approach, which I find very interesting. He doesn't talk about civilizations or ontologies, although he talks about ontological design as well, but this cosmological perspective, very interesting work. One more or final?
In your opinion, who is creating our world today? And if we are to tip the balance from people who have influence and power and money who are creating our world to really democratizing design and co-creating our future world, how do we create a shared understanding of what that world is so as to not allow, design bubbles that we all live in?
Difficult question also. I think that sort of like Bruno Latour talks about that the need to create a shared common understanding other people say, well, no, that's really not possible. I mean, it's good for you, a European, to say what your common understanding of the world is. Because in the end, I think Latour continues to be sort of Eurocentric in that sense. Very interesting work. I'm not saying that it's not interesting, but it's still sort of a liberal, humanistic, Eurocentric understanding of that world. And if you take somebody like, I'm thinking of, for instance, somebody like Ashish Nandi, and very interesting Indian psychologist who has been interested in the dialogues between civilizations, different civilizations and religions. He would say that there's no possible common understanding, shared understanding, other than something minimal that yes, of course, the life has to be preserved, the planet has to be preserved, and so forth, but certainly no common blueprint or plan of how to get from here to there, but no common image of the there, no common imagination of the there. Some features, we want something that is sustainable, that is socially just, where, all of the evils of contemporary societies, in all societies, I mean, for instance, all societies are patriarchal to a greater or lesser degree. Most societies are racist. So beyond that, but that doesn't help us much in terms of a path towards. The closest that some people, a group is articulating that, I think, this group is a network, it's a large network called the Great Transition Initiative. GTI, if you do a Google or gti.org, was started by about 15 people, a very international group, mostly people working from systems perspectives, in terms of sort of figuring out the trends towards the future and the eventual sort of collapse of many biological systems and social systems, and have produced a very compelling set of scenarios for moving from the current age to a different age, that they define something like sustainability, also global sustainable society. That is very interesting, it's very thought-provoking. It's still very academic. It's been sort of brought down to earth in more recent years through a series of conversations about politics and about social movements and about things. But I think that would be a good place to look into. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming, and this is as the last of the lecture series. This has been a real honor to be part of, and I know Mariana and I are just so happy with the way it ended, and thank you so much, Arturo, for being part of that. So thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody.